Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It's Saturday evening here on what day is it? It is February 21st. Time flies, and I'm going to follow up in this video and an accompanying article on the article that or the book that I reviewed last week, earlier this week, by John Rachel on America's peace dividend, which never happened. So I'm titling this story, "If you think those who stole the land from the Indians stopped, think again," or um, "You are the new Native Americans." Uh, So recently, I posted a review of John, and I'm going to be reading from the article, which is posted below this video, and I may skip some parts of it as I go through it, but you can get the idea. So recently, I posted a review of John Rachel's new book about the hijacked peace dividend, and he pointed out that at the end of the Cold War against the Soviet Union, it should have generated $9.12 trillion in freed up capital to invest in the civilian economy. Instead, the US military industrial complex gobbled it up. Well, the people who actually run the country, um, they have an interesting habit. And the erstwhile dictator of Russia, Vladimir Putin, who seems to be, uh, this question. I just got an email from a friend of mine who lives in Russia, and she says, that it's not exactly like Putin has a 90% approval rating, but he's basically this general consensus that he's the best person for the job, that appeals to all the different demographics within Russia, and there are various constituencies within Russia. But in any case, um, he referred to these people who are running the West as the vampires, and they're like human-like beings that live off the blood of us real humans. So I thought I would check and see just how much they have stolen from other countries, and then compare it with where our money has gone. And I think after listening to what I have to say here, I think you'll be kind of shocked. It's kind of it even shocks me, when I kind of know about this. And I'll finish off by saying, how did I do my research? Well, first of all, I'm starting this off, and you can see it below in the description, a video that was made 10 years ago explaining what the U.S. military actually is, and he calls it a cancer. He says, "Do you know what a cancer is? A voracious, wildly self-replicating rogue cell mass that feeds on and devours its host. If not identified, attacked, and eliminated, it will consume the body and destroy it. The U.S. military, with its vast, complex web of branches, agencies, and bureaucracies, is in socio-political terms a metastasized cancer run rampant in the American body politic." Now, first, I'm going to go through a list of sanctioned countries. Now, this is where I did a fair amount of research with the help of AI, but I think these are credible information. And when I do research, if I see something even in an AI search that looks questionable, I will question it, and you'll see actually that happens. So this is a list that says the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, that's OFAC, maintains sanction programs targeting specific countries and regions. The following is a list derived from the official OFAC regulations: Afghanistan, Belarus, Burma, also known as Myanmar, the Central African Republic, China, specifically for military-industrial complex and Hong Kong-related matters. By the way, what happened in Hong Kong a few years back, that was a clear example of how the U.S. goes in, messes up a geographical area. They send their agents in, they create dissent and real violence, And then when the government goes into, get control of the situation, oh, human rights, human rights. Well, maybe your CIA and NED and all these meddling agencies of the U.S. government, if you didn't go into these places, they wouldn't have these problems. So don't complain about the government. It's like, we complain. They say, oh, Russia caused the problem in Minnesota. Well, that's a different situation. There, they actually are really pissed at the government, and they didn't need Russia or China or anybody else to tell them, that they don't appreciate these thugs coming into their community and rounding people up and beating them up and shooting them. But when the U.S. goes into China, into Xinjiang or Tibet or Hong Kong, or in the case of Taiwan, where they're arming Taiwan, which is a province of China, which even the United States recognizes, then there's, China's so bad. So this is double standard is ridiculous. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. Cuba has been sanctioned, and Cuba is under terrible, terrible sanctions right now. They're basically starved. They literally plan to starve the people out. This is like Roman Empire style destruction of a country in order to bring it to its knees. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Mali, Nicaragua, North Korea, Russia, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen, and the Western Balkans. This is all according. This is the U.S. government website. We're screwing around with these countries. Heaven forbid they should have any sovereignty. The list is extensive and covers various regions with sanctions programs often tailored to specific threats, such as cyber-related activities, terrorism, or narcotics trafficking, in addition to country-specific regimes. Next subtopic is the reported amounts of frozen assets. While a complete accounting is not available, the search results provide specific figures for a few countries. These amounts can fluctuate due to new sanctions, asset seizures, or licenses that allow for the unfreezing of assets for specific purposes. And there's a table that follows. It says the countries of reported assets and notes. Afghanistan shows 3.5 billion. This amount belonging to the Afghan Central Bank was confirmed in a meeting between Afghan and U.S. officials. It is part of a larger sum with discussions ongoing about its release. Russia, nearly 5 trillion. This figure was cited by Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov as the amount frozen by the previous U.S. administration. Iran, it's not specified. Recent sanctions announcements, such as those from January 26th, target entities and assets, but do not provide a cumulative total of frozen funds. And so finding exact figures is difficult because the data is not centralized in a public, easy-to-access format. Here's why and how you might find more. Reporting requirements. So U.S. persons and financial institutions that hold blocked property are required to file reports with OFAC. These include initial reports within 10 business days of a blocking and annual reports on all property held as of June 30th. While these reports are filed with the government, the aggregate data is not typically published in a simple table. They're making it more difficult for us to figure out what's going on. The official sources. The most authoritative, though potentially cumbersome source for this information would be to search through official publications and reports from the U.S. Department of Treasury or OFACE, the Office of, Office of Financial, what do they call it again? OFACE is, let me go back here. It is the Office of Financial Assets Control. So back to the text here. There are specialized databases, commercial legal databases and services that specialize in sanctions and international trade law often compile and analyze this information for their clients, providing more detailed insights than what is freely available. So it's hard to access. And this is all information that it is AI generated, but nevertheless, I add my comments and they have to agree with me. So I comment, they had said that Russia was missing $5 billion. So I said to the AI engine, I thought the US has frozen 300, not 5 billion, 300 billion from Russia, not 5 billion. And they answer, you are absolutely right to question that figure. Your recollection of 300 billion is correct for the total frozen Russian assets globally. But the amount frozen specifically within the United States is indeed around 5 billion. The distinction is a common point of confusion. Well, if you're Russia, you don't care whether it's where it's frozen. All you know that $300 billion is in somebody else's hands, and you don't have a right to your own money. So the larger 300 billion figure represents the total value of Russian sovereign assets, primarily central bank funds, that have been frozen by all international partners combined, where it's held. The vast majority of these assets are not in the United States. An estimated 180 billion to 250 billion euros, or roughly 250 to 290 billion US dollars, is held in the European Union, mostly at the Belgian-based clearinghouse Euroclear. Smaller portions are held in Japan, the UK, Canada, and other G7 nations. Regarding the $5 billion figure assets frozen in the US, it refers specifically to the amount of Russian state assets held within the jurisdiction of the United States. So this figure has been confirmed by multiple sources. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov stated in January 2026 that the amounts frozen by the previous U.S. administration is slightly less than $5 billion. This is the number he cited when discussing potential allocations of these funds. Now, as for U.S. government data, an opinion piece by a former U.S. Treasury Department Assistant Secretary also noted that the U.S. publicly admitted to at least $5 billion in the unused Russian central bank reserves at the New York Federal Reserve. Furthermore, a new U.S. law, the Repo Act, requires banks to report Russian assets, with estimates suggesting that the U.S. banking system holds as much as $6 billion. The confusion is understandable, as many news reports refer to the larger 300 billion total without always specifying that it is the global sum. The following table summarizes the key difference. The location of frozen assets and reported amount includes frozen by all international partners, G7, EU, US, etc. And the amount held at the New York Fed and in US banks and in the European Union, it comes to about up to $250 billion, the largest portion primarily held at the Belgian clearinghouse Euroclear, which I just mentioned. And so I ask again, you list the AI engine, you list 23 countries. Is it possible to determine how much was frozen? I seem to recall 7 billion for Afghanistan and far more for Iran. So the answer, you're right to press for more detail. It's funny how AI, they say we're artificial intelligence, but they have a selective memory. You have to remind them of things. Compiling a complete list is difficult because the US government does not publish a single comprehensive public ledger of all the frozen assets by countries. Heaven forbid, we stole it, but we won't tell you where we're keeping it. The information is often fragmented, disclosed in policy announcements, or buried in financial reports. However, based on the search results and widely reported figures, I can update the information for Afghanistan and Iran and clarify the challenge with the other countries. So As for U.S. frozen assets, these are verified figures. We have Afghanistan is approximately $7 billion, as I have heard from news reports. This is the most frequently cited total. It appears your recollection, little old Eric, is correct. Official communications for the Afghan Ministry of Foreign Affairs in February 2026 mentioned 2.5 billion in unfrozen assets and referred to an additional 3.5 billion that remains blocked, totaling $7 billion. Now, Iran has about $10 billion roughly, and it says your recollection on this is also accurate, though the exact figure is a matter of policy debate. An opinion piece from early 2026 cites a potential deal to release 10 billion or more in frozen Iranian assets. This figure represents a significant portion of Iranian funds blocked in U.S. and allied nations' accounts, often from oil sales. Now, the Russian 5 to 6 billion, as we discussed, this is the amount confirmed to be held specifically within the United States. And as I mentioned, Dmitry Peskov reported that it's slightly less than 5 billion, but the U.S. law, the Repo Act, as I mentioned, suggests that the total U.S. banking system, it could be as high as 6 billion. Now, the challenge regarding the remaining countries, they cite the fact that there are 20 countries on the sanctions list. A public cumulative figure for frozen assets is not readily available. Here is why that information is hard to find. One, no centralized public data. The U.S. Treasury Department does not release a report that aggregates the total value of blocked property for every sanctioned country. While they publish data on the U.S. international reserve position, this shows that the United States owns not what it has frozen from others. Now, the nature of the sanctions. Sanctions against many countries, like Cuba, Syria, or North Korea, involve a broad, quote-unquote, asset freeze on designated individuals, companies, and government entities. The total value of these blocked accounts, properties, and business interests is not tallied up in a single public document. Policy versus accounting. Often, the amounts for countries like Iran are discussed in the context of potential diplomatic negotiations or deals. I love that word, deals. It's like, are they playing cards here or what? Or real estate transactions. Rather than a static accounting report, which is why figures like, quote unquote, 10 billion appear in policy discussions. And then we have the case of dynamic situations. The status of the assets can change. For example, sanctions on Syria were significantly lifted in mid-2025 following the fall of the Assad government and the insertion of a head-chopping ISIS guy as the president, meaning previously foreign assets may have been released or are no longer under the same restrictions. So try and keep your country together like Assad, and you get accused of all kinds of things. And then if a head chopper goes in and becomes president, then they release the funds. This is how U.S. policy works. In short, while we can confirm the figures for Afghanistan, Iran, and Russia, the data for other countries is not publicly aggregated in an accessible format. It remains scattered across various government actions, legal cases, and classified financial records. So I ask, well, can you specify a sanctions program for, let's say, the top 5 countries? So they say, we've identified the top 5 sanctioned countries and regions based on recent policy activity and strategic importance, as highlighted in the search results. For example, here are 5 specific programs, recent actions, and key features. First, China. Sanctions on China are primarily focused on advanced technology, military end users, and human rights, making it one of the most dynamic and closely watched areas of U.S. sanction policy. The core focus. The U.S. sanctions regime targets China's military-industrial complex, particularly for acquiring advanced semiconductors and AI technology. The Bureau of Industry and Security has used tools like the quote-unquote military end user restrictions to control exports of items that could contribute to China's military capabilities. In recent developments. Policy in 2025 saw significant instability, including pauses in license processing and revocation of some previously approved export licenses. There are ongoing uncertainty about the rules for exporting advanced chips like the NVIDIA H200 to China. There are some key mechanisms, restrictions under the Export Administration regulations, ownership screening due to the 50% rule in sanctions and specific end-use controls on advanced computer items. Next is Venezuela. Following the recent capture of Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela's sanctions landscape is in a state of flux, balancing the need for leverage with the desire to attract U.S. energy investment. Well, since we're stealing Venezuela's assets, we have to end the sanctions so that we can get control of the assets which we're stealing anyway. The sanctions target the Venezuelan state, its oil sector, and individuals associated with the former Maduro regime. The primary goal is to support democratic transition. So, we invade the country, we take out and kidnap its leader in complete violation of international law, and we call that democratic transition. This is AI. They're very intelligent. The capture of Maduro in early January 26th has created a delicate policy challenge. The U.S. must decide whether to offer credible sanctions relief to encourage energy investment while maintaining leverage. Most Venezuela measures were imposed by executive action, meaning they can be licensed, suspended, or revoked quickly, which creates both opportunity and instability for long-term investors. So the key mechanisms are on the oil industry, designation of individuals and entities for undermining democracy. So I guess what they're talking about is we should be sanctioning ourselves for undermining their democracy, but whatever. We can't even run an honest election ourselves. Secondary sanctions risk for foreign companies doing business with sanctioned Venezuelan entities. Number 3, Iran. Iran remains under a maximum pressure campaign with relentless new designations targeting its oil industry and the shadow fleet that facilitates its exports. Shadow fleet means any company that doesn't pay premiums to, Lloyd's of London. If we don't get our money from you guys, you're no good. How dare you resist our extortion? So the focus here is to deprive the Iranian regime of revenues used for destabilizing activities. So we're destabilizing them, and we accuse them of destabilizing us. For their support of terrorist proxies, you mean like the MEK, which was declared a terrorist organization, and then the U.S. government decided that they'd rather use it against Iran, so they took away its designation as a terrorist organization. So if there are terrorists, they're not terrorists. This is what they're talking about here. The primary target is the petroleum and petrochemical sector. And the recent developments, the U.S. continues to aggressively target Iran's shadow fleet. We've talked about what a shadow fleet is. Recent actions in January and February 2026 have sanctioned numerous entities, individuals, and vessels, including LPG carriers, that's liquid petroleum gas, for shipping Iranian petroleum, cutting off hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. This effort is codified under Executive Order 13902 and the President's National Security Presidential Memorandum Number 2. The key mechanisms are that there is sanctions on foreign entities and individuals involved in the purchase, transport, or facilitation of Iranian oil, designations under non-proliferation authorities for weapons of mass destruction related transfers, and targeting downstream buyers. Number 4 on the list, Russia. Sanctions on Russia are deeply entrenched and focus relentlessly on curbing energy revenue, which funds the war in Ukraine. New legislative proposals aim to close existing loopholes. So the core focus is to degrade Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine by targeting its primary revenue source, oil and gas exports. This includes sanctions on major energy companies and the entities that facilitate Russian oil trade. So there's a recent development is the newly introduced bipartisan Decreasing Russian Oil Profits Act of 2026, otherwise known as DROP. It would mandate sanctions on any foreign person or entity involved in purchasing Russian oil or petroleum products. It aims to close loopholes that allow Russia to use a shadow fleet of tankers and sell oil above the international price cap. So we're dictating to Russia how much they can sell their oil for. Interesting. We're the world asset manager, apparently. Experts note increasing divergence between the US, UK, and EU sanctions on Russia. And there are also sanctions on Russian energy firms, restrictions on doing business with entities in the Russian financial sector, wind down and divestment licenses, and now proposed mandatory sanctions on foreign oil purchases. So we're not just sanctioning Russia, we're sanctioning the people who do business with Russia. And number 5 is Cuba. The U.S. has recently escalated pressure on Cuba through a novel combination of a national emergency declaration and the threat of secondary tariffs on third countries. Cuba was declared to be a national security threat to the United States. This country, it's been basically under the thumb of the U.S. since the Spanish-American War. They managed to free themselves from gangster capitalists, Meyer Lansky and others of his ilk in 1959 with the Cuban Revolution, and the U.S. has just never forgiven them. How dare you exercise sovereignty, Cuba, you tiny little country. You're a threat to us because you won't buckle to our extortion. Recent developments. In late 2026, President Trump signed Executive Order 14380, declaring a national emergency with respect to Cuba. This order authorizes the U.S. to impose tariffs on all goods imported from any country that supplies oil to Cuba. While the tariffs have not yet been imposed, the framework creates immediate risk for countries like Mexico, Russia, and Algeria, which have been key oil suppliers to the island. The unprecedented use of country-based tariffs as a sanctions enforcement tool, combined with the long-standing embargo under statutes like the Helms-Burton Act and OFAC regulations. So that's how they're creating sanctions on Cuba. So now the next question is, estimate the number of value of Russian diplomatic properties that Obama seized and has not returned. So here you are, you've got this, you've bought properties fair and square on the US market, and then the US government says, sorry, we're taking them back. So based on the available information, here's an estimate for the value of Russian diplomatic properties seized under President Obama in 2016. And I might add, there's a Fourth Amendment called illegal search and seizure. The U.S. government, by the Bill of Rights, which applies to anybody within U.S. jurisdiction, says you can't just illegally take people's stuff. And yet here they are, they're taking people's stuff. So it's important to note that this is not a complete list of these such properties, and the total value of all seized diplomatic assets is not specified in the search results. But in any case, in 2016, the Obama administration ordered the seizure of 2 Russian diplomatic compounds as part of sanctions in retaliation for Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, which has been proven not to have happened. Ray McGovern and Bill Binney who are both highly experienced intelligence experts, proved that the theft of the emails from the Democratic Party servers, computer servers, was an inside job. It was done by a disgruntled employee. It was not hacked by Russians, and yet they've punishing Russia for a crime that they didn't even commit. So the property location we have is Pioneer Point, 88 million to 8.5 million, is a 45-acre estate on Maryland's Eastern Shore, purchased by the Soviet Union in 1972. It includes a 33-room Georgian-style brick mansion with 13 fireplaces and a 3,000-bottle wine cellar. And we have on Long Island, the New York Elmcroft estate is a 14-acre estate in Upper Brookville, Oyster Bay, purchased by the Soviets in 1952. It was built in 1918 and formerly owned by New York Governor Nathan Miller. They give important context. It is worth noting that Russia maintains at least one additional diplomatic property in the U.S. that was not seized in 2016, the Killenworth estate, also on Long Island, which was purchased by the Soviets in the 1940s and remains in Russian hands. So the total value of all Russian diplomatic properties seized by the United States is difficult to determine from the search research results, as the Long Island property's value is not provided. The Maryland estate is valued at over $8 million based on tax records and news reports from 2016. There's no information in the search results indicating that these properties have been returned. And as recently as 2025, Russia was still pushing for their return as part of broader asset negotiations with the United States. As an addendum to this aspect, Trump has sent two real estate guys, Jared Kushner, his brother-in-law, his son-in-law, and his real estate buddy, Steve Witkoff, to Moscow, and they're doing various kinds of negotiations and about future wonderful business deals that we can do with Russia that's going to make America rich. And yet the U.S. has done absolutely nothing to return these properties that, again, they violate the U.S. Constitution to just steal people's stuff. And yet the U.S. expects Russia to do business with the U.S. It's a little bit naive, to say the least, in my opinion. Okay, the next topic here. What about gold from various countries that has been seized? So I've heard that gold held by various countries, such as Venezuela, Ukraine, Iraq, and Libya, has also been seized. And Germany has requested its gold back from storage in the U.S., but is meeting resistance. So here's a summary of the current status of gold and assets based on available information. Venezuela had 161 metric tons worth $22 billion, reportedly seized by the U.S. in January 2026. 113 tons worth $52 billion are frozen in Switzerland. $2 billion is frozen in the Bank of England. So let's see. Germany has 1,236 tons worth $194 billion stored at the New York Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank. Germany faces resistance and concerns over repatriation due to U.S. unpredictability. So here's Germany. You got your gold in the U.S. bank, and Germany says, "Could we please give us our gold back?" Well, we'll think about it. Germany considers itself a U.S. ally. They can't even get their damn gold back. And then we have the case of Libya. Libya had $32 billion in frozen assets reportedly held in the U.S., and it faces legal challenge and risk of erosion. And then in terms of Ukraine and Iraq, specific gold reserves, there's no specific information found in the search results regarding the seizure of Ukrainian or Iraqi gold reserves. I heard that shortly after the 2014 coup, that a plane flew out of Ukraine with a bunch of gold, and they don't know what happened to it. Well, and then the U.S. says, we've given you so much money to pursue your war with the Russians, and except we're using your gold to pay for it, probably. So anyway, here's a detailed breakdown by country. Let's see, we've got here, it says Venezuela's gold is the most intricate and involves multiple locations and forms of asset control. So it says, in a dramatic development, the U.S. military's Operation Absolute Resolve in early January 2026, which led to the capture of President Nicolas Maduro, also resulted in the seizure of 161 metric tons of Venezuelan gold that was reportedly destined for Shanghai. This move has been described as a geopolitical bombshell and has sparked a crisis of trust regarding sovereign immunity. Imagine that, Venezuela, you say, not only did we steal your president, we stole your gold. NewsGuard's reality check, however, cautions that while the gold seizure is in fact, some Russian state media outlets have spread baseless claims about U.S. cargo planes looting the gold, a narrative not supported by evidence. So maybe they didn't. I just present what they're talking about. You can decide, does the U.S. government have any record of stealing countries' gold? Gold frozen in Switzerland. Beyond the U.S. seizure, a separate cache of Venezuelan gold is frozen in Switzerland. Between 2013 and 2016, Venezuela shipped 113 tons of gold, valued at approximately $52 billion at that time. And we're talking, the gold has tripled in price since then. Swiss authorities moved to freeze these assets along with those of his associates for an initial period of 4 years. How nice. The Swiss government said, we're just freezing your assets. It's wonderful. The stated goal is to prevent capital flight, and potentially return the funds to the Venezuelan people. Though critics view this as another instance of Switzerland's selective neutrality aligning with U.S. interests. Again, regarding Venezuela, gold frozen in the UK, approximately 2 billion of Venezuelan gold remains frozen in the Bank of England, a situation that predates the recent military intervention. And then the battle over Venezuelan assets extends beyond gold. A U.S. court has blessed a $5.9 billion bid for a controlling stake in Citgo Petroleum Company, a Houston-based refiner owned by Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA. This sale is intended to satisfy multi-billion-dollar claims from Canadian mining companies like Crystal X International and Rusoro Mining, whose assets were appropriated by the Venezuelan government years ago. This has been characterized by Venezuela as a vulgar and barbaric dispossession. It's like, the West has this idea that the material assets of a country, its mineral wealth, somehow doesn't belong to the country that it's sitting on it. It belongs to some foreign corporation. Regarding the German struggle to repatriate gold from the U.S., Germany is requesting its gold back and is a matter of intense public debate. I've been following this story for years, though it hasn't resulted in any formal successful transfer. The U.S. just, it's just like, no, we're not going to give you back your gold. Germany, the world's second largest holder of gold reserves, stores a significant portion of its gold abroad, a practice dating back to the Cold War. As of early 2026, approximately 1,236 metric tons of German gold, valued at about 164 billion euros or $194 billion, remain in the vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The Soviet Union has fallen. There's no danger of the Ruskies coming in and stealing Germany's gold. But the U.S. says, we're keeping your gold to save it from the Russians, even though the Cold War was over. So, possession is 9/10 of the law. Sorry, Germany. Good luck trying to get your gold back. The research indicates significant resistance to German requests for repatriation, or at least deep concern that such a request would be problematic. This is driven by the perceived unpredictability of the Trump administration and fears that the U.S. might restrict access to the gold in a geopolitical dispute. In Germany, said, please give us our gold back. Well, we'll think about it. Politicians, economists, and taxpayer groups are increasingly vocal, arguing that storing such a strategic asset in a country that is no longer a reliable partner, that is the U.S., is too risky. However, the German Federal Bank and the government are pushing back against these calls. Bundesbank President Joachim Nagel has stated he has no cause for concern and believes the gold is safe under established international agreements. The official position is that the gold is regularly audited and that holding reserves in multiple locations, including a major financial center like New York, provides liquidity and diversifies risk. They're rationalizing. The debate thus remains a heated political issue with no resolution in sight. Libya. The issue of Libya is less about gold specifically and more about its vast sovereign wealth, which remains frozen internationally. Recent disclosures related to the Epstein files have highlighted the vulnerability of Libya's frozen assets. According to documents released by the U.S. Department of Justice, there were attempts as early as July 2011 to pursue claims against Libyan assets held in the United States, which are reportedly valued at $32.4 billion. Libya is a country with less than 10 million population. $32 billion, that's a lot of money, and they can't get their hands on it. And the country's a mess, which is our responsibility. We destroyed it. This has sparked concerns in Libya, understandably, that its political fragmentation and lack of a unified legal strategy could leave these vital national assets vulnerable to international legal challenge and legal vultures. While the UN has approved the release of some funds, about $1.5 billion for humanitarian aid, the bulk of the frozen assets remains in a precarious state. In other words, when we destroyed that country, we stole their gold. And next, we have Ukraine and Iraq. The research results provided do not contain any specific information about the seizure of their national gold reserves by the U.S. It is possible these recollections stem from other contexts, such as confusion with other assets. The U.S. has provided significant financial and military aid to Ukraine and has frozen assets of Russian oligarchs, but this is distinct from seizing Ukraine's own gold. And historical events. The 2016 invasion of Iraq did lead to the seizure of many state assets, but the specific fate of Iraq's gold reserves is not addressed in these search results. I'll just add as a mention that after the 2014 coup, the United States sent a woman who was basically a vulture capitalist hedge fund person to Ukraine. She immediately got instant citizenship as a Ukrainian citizen and became the head of their financial sector. So here's this vulture capitalist, as in picking over carcasses, being imported by the United States and then getting control of Ukraine's assets. I think there might be a little bit of theft going on there. Okay, so then we have, so I asked the question, given how fluid these geopolitical and financial situations are, especially Venezuela, what about checking on some more specific cases? Now, in Nicaragua, took the U.S. to court and won a $100 million judgment due to U.S. actions against Nicaragua during the Reagan administration. I remember that case because Reagan was saying that Nicaragua was threatening Texas, this little country, dirt poor, and they're a threat to Texas. This is the Reagan administration, who's given great marks for its patriotism. The thuggery is called patriotism. What happened to that? And are there other court judgments against the U.S. that the U.S. did not pay? So it turns out that Nicaragua did win a case against the United States at the International Court of Justice. However, the judgment was for $17 billion, a site figured by Nicaragua, not 100 million. To date, the United States has not paid this judgment, and the legal and political status of the claim is complex. The case, Nicaragua versus United States. In 1984, Nicaragua filed a petition at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, accusing the U.S. of a range of illegal activities, such as training, arming, equipping, and financing the Contra rebel groups, which are basically terrorists, mining Nicaragua's harbor, which damaged foreign ships, directing attacks on Nicaraguan ports and oil facilities, and violating Nicaraguan airspace. In its historic ruling on June 27, 1986, the ICJ found the United States guilty of breaching international law by using force and intervening in the affairs of another state. The court ordered the U.S. to pay reparations to Nicaragua. Nicaragua initially sought over $1 billion, but the later figure of $17 billion became the commonly cited amount for the reparations owed. So what happened? The U.S. response in Nicaragua's 1991 waiver. The United States rejected the court's jurisdiction. If we do it, tough for you, and refused to participate in the merit phase of the proceedings. The U.S. argued that the ICJ was not equipped to handle such a complex political and military case. What's complex about hiring a bunch of terrorists to attempt to destroy Nicaragua? And Nicaragua is saying, we really don't appreciate that and we want to be paid. But they call it complex. Furthermore, when Nicaragua tried to enforce the judgment through the UN Security Council, the U.S. used its veto power to block any enforcement action. The situation took a critical turn in 1991. Following a change in government in Nicaragua, the administration of President Violeta Chamorro took steps to normalize relationships with the U.S. Oh, please don't be so mean to us. We won't bother you anymore. As part of this process of normalization, Nicaragua officially dropped its claim for reparations before the ICJ. In a letter to the court, Nicaragua stated that it had decided to renounce all further right of action based on the case and did not wish to go on with the proceedings. How much did the U.S. pay this Quisling to drop the case? So despite the 1991 waiver, the issue has never fully disappeared. President Daniel Ortega, who returned to power in 2007, has repeatedly revived the claim, particularly during times of tension with the U.S. And in 2023, Nicaragua urged the U.S. to pay what it now calls a historical debt. So I think I'm going to skip some of this stuff, but are there any other court judgments the U.S. has not paid? Well, there's the case of the Legrand case, Germany versus United States in 2001. I won't go through that, but anyway, that's another one of these cases where the U.S. basically stiffs international law. And so to sum it all up for this section, in short, the U.S. has a mixed record of compliance with international court judgment. I wouldn't say it's mixed, it's quite clear. It's got a long-standing record of flouting international law and ripping off countries. While it often adheres to rulings in commercial and treaty-based disputes, it has shown resistance when rulings touch on core issues of sovereignty, other countries' sovereignty, criminal justice, or national security, otherwise known as our desire to meddle in other countries' affairs, as seen in the Nicaragua and Avena cases. So, as I say, this does not look like a mixed record. It looks like patterns of decades of financial piracy. Okay, so that's what we see here. These are international scandals, what the U.S. does to other countries. Now we're going to talk about what the United States does to itself. So here's a list of some of the most significant historical financial scandals in the United States, recent examples. The Teapot Dome scandal of the 1920s. This scandal is often regarded as the granddaddy of modern political corruption cases. It involved the secret leasing of U.S. Navy oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, by Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall. In exchange for the no-bid leases, no corruption there, Fall received upwards of $400,000 in cash, bonds, and gifts from oil executives Harry Sinclair, probably of Sinclair Petroleum, and Edward Doheny. The value of the oil reserves was potentially several $100 million at the time. So, $400,000 investment in corruption, and they get several $100 million back. That's like a 1,000,000-to-1 return. Easy money if you can do it. While the government eventually got the land back, the scandal represented a massive theft of public resources for private gain. Fall was later convicted of bribery, the first former U.S. cabinet member to go to prison. Okay, now the next case, I remember living through this. This is the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s and 1990s. This is a massive financial failure that cost taxpayers dearly. It involved the collapse of over 1,000 savings and loan associations, the thrift banks. These are like local community banks, due to a combination of risky investments, fraud, and inadequate regulation. The reason why it's inadequate is because they wanted it to be inadequate so they can get away with this shit. The federal government created the Resolution Trust Company to manage the cleanup. The total estimated cost of the crisis to American interests, that is yours and my interests, is about $153 billion, with taxpayers ultimately footing the bill for approximately $124 billion in bailout costs that were never recovered. Then we have the Enron scandal. And I was watching the Enron scandal in 2001, and I had some clients, and I had a newsletter in which I asked the question of whether the Bush administration was going to get away with the Enron scandal, and a couple of wealthy clients fired me because they're Republicans. They didn't like me raising this issue. Anyway, the collapse of energy giant Enron remains one of the most infamous corporate fraud cases in U.S. history. Executives used fraudulent accounting practices to hide billions of dollars in debt and inflate the company's stock price. When the truth emerged, Enron collapsed, causing approximately $74 billion in losses in shareholder value. The fallout was devastating, costing 4,000 employees their jobs and many their life savings. Investors eventually recovered a portion of their losses through a $7.2 billion settlement from financial institutions accused of complicity. So that's like 74 billion turns into 7.2 billion to get back. Some people get back. The scandal led to the creation of the Sarbanes-Oakley Act, which tightened corporate governance and accounting rules. Then we have the WorldCom scandal. Of course, this doesn't even talk about the dot-com crisis, but anyway, this is one case. Just months after Enron, telecommunications giant WorldCom, which was supposed to be one of the darlings of the dot-com era, collapsed in an even larger accounting fraud. The company had inflated its assets by a staggering $11 billion, leading to a loss of approximately $180 billion in shareholder value. It was the largest bankruptcy in the U.S. history at that time. The scandal further eroded public trust in corporate America and reinforced the need for the Sarbanes-Oakley reforms. Moving on, the Madoff Ponzi scheme, discovered in 2008, operated for decades by former NASDAQ chairman, the thieves are in control of the chicken coop here. This is the largest financial fraud in U.S. history. It was a classic Ponzi scheme where early investors were paid with money from newer investors, all while generating no legitimate profits. The estimated total fabricated losses were around $65 billion. Thousands of individuals, charities, and institutional investors were defrauded. To date, the Department of Justice's Madoff Victim Fund has returned over $4.3 billion to victims, recovering covering approximately 93.7% of proven losses. Well, it says the fabricated losses were 65 billion. They say they recovered 4 billion. They say it's recovering 97%. I don't understand that arithmetic. So the 2008 financial crisis was not a single scandal, but a systematic collapse triggered by the bursting of the housing bubble. It was fueled by widespread predatory lending, the bundling of risky subprime mortgages into complex securities, and a failure of financial regulation. Major institutions like Lehman Brothers collapsed, while others like AIG, that's a insurance company, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac, which are they're quasi-government entities that finance mortgages. They required massive government bailouts. The government's response, including the Troubled Assets Relief Program, involved trillions of dollars in potential commitments. While many programs ultimately turned a profit, the crisis caused a deep recession, trillions in lost household wealth, and immense economic hardship for millions of Americans. Now, my comment on this, I was in the financial service business at that time, and a loan broker, that's a guy that loans houses to do mortgages. He said, he comes to our office, he says, I got this great idea. What you're going to do is go to your clients and tell them to withdraw all the money out of their houses as equity and money out of their insurance policies, and just borrow against them, and then buy real estate. And the interest rate on the loans is only going to be 1%. So they're going to pay very, very little amount for that, very little amount of interest payments for this to dramatically increase the number of real estate holdings that they have. But what they didn't tell them was that they could change the interest rates from 1% to 13%, which would mean that the value of they would not be able to pay the loan. They would lose the house. I actually met a woman who lost her family home and an investment property. So you had that situation, and people lost literally tens of millions of dollars, and many people lost their houses completely. And what Obama did was he said to the banks, "I'm the only one standing between you and the pitchforks." So he bailed out the bankers, but he didn't bail out the homeowners. And the bankers, not only did the bankers get made whole on their bad, fraudulent loans, but they also got the property. So the people got screwed both ways. And finally, here's a case of the Catherine Austin Fitts. Now, in 2003, I believe it was, I attended a presentation by Mike Rupert, who was one of the 9/11 whistleblowers, and also who was there was this woman, Catherine Austin Fitts. And after the presentation, this is 2003, I said, with all this stuff that's going on, what do you think about gold? And she said, well, I don't give individual financial advice, but yeah, gold might be a good idea. This is in 2003. So if you were accumulating gold since 2003, you're probably doing pretty well right now, because the price of gold then was it was as low as $380, and now it's like $5,000 an ounce. Anyway, Catherine Austin Fitts was a Wall Street pioneer. She became the first woman managing director in the 156-year-old history of Dillon Read and Company. And she was a Bush appointee, that is, the George H.W. Bush presidential campaign nominated her. And she was appointed Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for Housing. She was billed as the cleaning lady of HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, tasked with repairing the department's reputation after the savings and loan crisis. At HUD, she discovered the department had a $300 billion portfolio of mortgage insurance, but only one certified actuary. She proposed innovative reforms to sell foreclosed houses to nonprofits at discounts. Sounds like a fair idea. So the innovation that started it all is, after leaving government in 1990, Fitz founded the Hamilton Securities Group, an employee-owned investment bank. Interesting. This woman is a conservative Republican, and yet she's creating a co-op. This is a kind of a socialist type of thing. How dare she? In 1993, Hamilton won a contract with HUD to help manage its massive $500 billion investment portfolio. And Fitz developed a revolutionary software tool called Community Wizard. And what this software did was it would track federal dollar flows down to the community level, show precisely how much money was being spent in each neighborhood, and compare spending with actual outcomes on the ground, and reveal massive inefficiencies and potential fraud. For example, Fitz discovered that in some communities, HUD would spend $200,000 to $250,000 per apartment to rehab public housing, while only $50,000 would have been allowed the purchase and rehab of a foreclosed property in the same neighborhood. So the software made this kind of waste stick out like a sore thumb. So $250,000 versus the actual cost is $50,000. The whistleblowing, what she uncovered. She uncovered the fact that HUD was systematically overpaying with housing rehabilitation, potential money diversion. She suspected that the overpayments were a mechanism to funnel money into unaudited black budget programs for military and intelligence agencies. Fraud indicators. The data suggested some federally guaranteed mortgage securities may have been fraudulently issued. And $2.2 billion in savings. Hamilton's work had actually saved the Federal Housing Authority Fund $2.2 billion by raising recovery rates on defaulted mortgages from 35 to 70 to 90%. Her fundamental claim, HUD's mission of spurring economic growth, was secondary to using it as a fundraising mechanism for national security agencies. The retribution, how she was destroyed. What happened next reads like a John Grisham novel or Enemy of the State. So in 1996, a disgruntled HUD contractor named John Irving filed a secret qui tam lawsuit against Hamilton Securities and others under the False Claims Act. I won't go through the whole text here, but basically the bottom line was that after years of legal persecution by the U.S. government, they found that a building custodian later swore in an affidavit that the Department of Justice intended to plant false evidence in Hamilton's basement documents to frame the country. And after 7 years of fighting, the result was total vindication. All investigations closed with prejudice, meaning investigators stated they found no evidence of any wrongdoings by either Fitz or Hamilton. No charges ever filed, but the damage was done. Fitz's personal assets were gone, as one report noted. The government's actions exhausted the target's resources, that is Fitz resources, through what Fitz called enforcement terrorism. The larger allegations, and this is where it all comes together. Everything that I've talked about, from the stealing assets of other countries to these scams that have been going on for decades in the United States. Fitz went on to develop a broader critique of how Washington works. She calls it the tapeworm economy. Systematic corruption. The problem isn't lack of regulation, but systematic corruption tolerated by both parties. Black budgets, trillions of dollars, flow through unaudited channels to the intelligence and military programs. The tapeworm economy. Parasitic interests suck the wealth out of local communities and into centralized, unaccountable hands. Missing trillions. with a T, hearkening back to John Rachel. In 2017, she co-authored a study claiming $21 trillion in unauthorized spending by the Department of Defense and Housing Urban Development over 17 years. What made her story credible and why what it matters? Fitz was not a fringe activist or a disgruntled employee. She was a Republican who worked for George H.W. Bush, a Wall Street executive with a pristine reputation. She had passed 18 audits, was cleared by every investigation. She was praised by Al Gore's Reinventing Government initiative, which gave her the Hammer Award for excellence in beating waste before the persecution began. As one commentator noted, her sin was trying to make government spending transparent. Widespread adoption of her software would have made the housing bubble impossible. She wrote a letter to National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, another one of these corrupt officials under the George W. Bush administration. And in 2004, she demonstrated she had lost none of her fire. She accused Rice of being complicit in the deaths of 9/11 victims by failing to warn them, writing, "You knew, you kept silent, they died. They knew 9/11 was going to happen and they let it happen." The letter is a remarkable document, a whistleblower fully exonerated, speaking truth to power with nothing left to lose. I remember one of the things that she said, if we can face it, God can fix it. And here we are, 2026, and we still haven't faced it. Why this matters today. The Fitz case illustrates several enduring truths. Transparency is threatening to those who benefit from opacity. The system protects itself through overwhelming legal force against individuals. Think Epstein and his victims. Exoneration is not restitution. Being proven right doesn't restore what was taken. And both parties play the game. Her persecution began under Clinton and continued through both administrations. So this is her story, and it's a reminder that whistleblowers often pay the highest price for their courage, even when they're proven right. This has all been AI generated, but because I've done the research on this previously, I'm quite familiar. They filled in the detail, which I knew the general situation of. So here's a conclusion. What we have here is a study in publicly available documents showing decades of corruption. It's bad enough what the U.S. has done to multiple countries to extort and pirate their wealth, but it actually pales in contrast with the ongoing theft of the wealth of the American people. It bears worth repeating. The tapeworm economy, or what the video calls military cancer, funneled, according to credible research, $17 trillion, much of which flows to unaccountable black budgets, mainly funding U.S. illegal operations of the security state, and it appears that there's no end in sight. At least by presenting the larger context to John Rachel's book, we can see what happened to the peace dividends. Powerful interests stole it. And meanwhile, the country, the people, the communities are economically starving to death. Only public awareness can have a hope of turning this around. What we see here is the financial equivalent of the Epstein files. And of course, both are interconnected. A final note, although much of the content here is made with the help of AI research, I have used my own historical memory of all these abuses to ferret out the details. So again, I'll never charge access for my content, but as I say, truth is priceless. And so I will not charge for this. There will never be a paywall. But what you can do is support my channel by either becoming a member or buying a chipping in some money for buy me a coffee, or buying one of my information keyboard T-shirts, such as this question everything. And you can see that when you question things, you get some really interesting answers. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation. It's been a little longer than usual, but I hope that it hasn't bored you and you've learned some things that you didn't know previously. So thanks again for listening, and I will talk with you again soon.